Hello, I'm Earl Weinberg, and this is Book Circle Presents An Ever-Mounted Cavalry. Our friend Lieutenant Fletcher and Roger Blackholt have invaded the secret laboratory of the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi occult branch. And they have discovered, much to their shock, a centaur. The men moved no more than the body on the tables. Smoke drifted in from upstairs. They heard distant gunfire. "How?" Roger began. "It's not one of ours," Fletcher said firmly. "By a chilly providence, Fitzsimmons got every man home, alive or dead, changed or not. We know where every Grand Norman centaur is." "Good. He's quite dead." The centaur looked it. There was a deflated quality, a flaccidity to the body. No breath, of course, nor was there a little pump working to supply such deficiencies, and the air in this room was colder than the rest of the house, morgue cold. No healing charms running, we know they use those. They stepped in for a closer look. "This is a surgical centaur," Fletcher declared. "What?" "Made by surgery, not magic. Well, yes, I'm sure some magic was involved, getting mutually foreign tissues to knit, molding bone and such, lots of alchemy. But basically, they cobbled together a man and a horse." "Didn't work, did it?" said Roger. "Look at the stitching around the waist. Doesn't look healed to me. And all those scars up the spine and at the back of the head. I wonder who—" Fletcher stepped up to the table. There was a notebook tethered to it. He pulled it off and showed it to Roger. It was titled Autopsy Protocol, Autopsy Log. "This may tell us." Roger stepped up too and surveyed the body. "This is pathetic. Look at the join. Not only is it not healed up, it's all worked around wrong. The human abdominals should repeat and extend down to the equine clavicle, not have equine tendons running under the human skin." He moved to the other side. "Look at the butchery on the spine, especially around the join, and the incisions across the top of the head, where the motor areas are. I wonder at what point the poor bastard died. It's ghastly. It is monstrous." He grimaced and clutched protectively at the front of his coat. Fletcher noted the object outlined under the cloth. "What's that?" After a moment of consideration, he added, "It's enchanted." Sheepishly, Roger pulled it out. It was a short wooden rod with a sharp tip at one end, made of some dark material. Fletcher's magical perceptions were simple, but this spell was familiar to him. "A quarrel? One of the magic arrows?" he asked rhetorically. "Uncle Edward calls it a sagitta." "As in Sagittarius, right. Is that one of his?" "Yes, it won't make a bloody hash like this. I'm sure. Your uncle is a fine advertisement for his own magic. What did you bring it for?" "Well, there's only one thing you could have brought it for, so why? I mean, I suppose you have your family yearning, but why here and now?" "In case we need to make a fast getaway," Roger mumbled, barely intelligible through the gas mask. Fletcher laughed. "And the brandy in the flask is purely for medicinal purposes, I assure you." Roger glowered at him and turned red. "Have you had any practice with the shape? With the seeming skin or something?" The mumble continued. "A couple of times." "How much time, total?" An awkward pause, then, 2 or 3 hours." 2? Fletcher mentally converted this to 1 and a bit. His line of thought was diverted by repeated sound of gunfire. Was it louder? Did he hear voices, too? "Well, quick now, let's take our pictures and samples." Fletcher photographed the body, the instruments, the bottles and vessels. Roger found a new color of pickle juice, as Fletcher called it, clearer, brownish green, calculated to put you off your tea, as Roger said. They seemed to have pumped it into the centaur. "I am so glad," said Roger, "that we let those horses go." "Yes, I think they were prepared to try 3 more times." He listened to the gunfire. "Let's wrap up here and look upstairs." They strode quickly through the other ground floor rooms, photographing without close-up shots, finding nothing as dramatic as the half-assembled Ubersoldat or the Centaur. Upstairs, where the grenades had landed, it was smokier, of course. Here were more benches of chemical apparatus. Here also were filing cabinets and desks. The chemical apparatus looked more delicate, less familiar, and Fletcher could sense little traces of multiple kinds of magic. Here, therefore, was where alchemical research was going on. He left Roger to inspect, sample, and photograph, and started going through files and desks. He kept an ear cocked for the sound of gunfire. There was far too much paper to take or photograph more than a tiny sample. Fletcher was looking for something choice. He grabbed some letters off the nearest desk, then started opening drawers, hoping to see some papers with numbers labeled RM for Reich marks. That would have a good chance of being useful. The bottom drawer was full of bottles. Something for Roger, then. Fletcher plunged a hand in and pulled one out. It was empty, a small brown glass bottle containing nothing but nevertheless sealed with a lightly waxed cork. There was a label, SS Unterführer Otto Nerlinger. He plucked out another, SS Mann Burkhard Voigt. A suspicion blossomed in his mind. As he had expected of Miss Blackholt, Fletcher was ghost sensitive. Most Grand Normans were. Ghosts were just a fact of life, if usually a transient one. But ghosts came in different degrees of manifestation. If it was a low degree, they were easy to miss. Fletcher studied the two bottles in his hand, then the collection in the drawer, waiting for the feeling of presence. "Mr. Blackholt," he called after a few seconds, "come look at this." When Roger arrived, he passed him the bottles and gestured at the drawer. "Ghosts. Of SS men, it appears." He plucked up a few more and glanced at the labels. "No, not all SS, but a lot of them. What do you think they're for?" "I'm sure I don't know," Roger said, putting Nerlinger and Voigt down on the desk hastily. "I don't even understand how ghosts can be bottled. Aren't they? I don't really know much about necromancy." Fletcher snorted. "I am actually relieved to hear that a scion of one of our foremost magical families knows nothing about necromancy. Now, the head chaplain of the Vanguard has to know a fair bit. As a consequence, he also knows the inside of a whiskey bottle very well, and we have standing orders not to let him fall asleep for 12 hours after a case. He explained ghost bottling to me once while waiting to be allowed to hit the pillow after a ghost trading case. If the ghost is to haunt at all, it has to hang on to the material world, at least a little. If it's putting forth a lot of effort and has the vis for it, it can present as a full image of itself, glamour, or at least very like. At the opposite end of the scale, when they're exhausted, which is most of the time, they still have to hang on to a tiny wisp of air, and that can be bottled. Now, what have we here? Or rather, who?" He began plucking bottles out and looking at them. "Might be worthwhile to take a few captives and audit them, though I'm not going to do it. Not again. High ranks would be best." Overcoming a visible reluctance, Roger began pulling out bottles and checking labels. After a little, he said, "I think I recognize this name." He handed Fletcher a bottle labeled General Field Marshal Walter von Ruschenau. Fletcher whistled. "Yes, indeed. Responsible for some massacres and the Severity Order, the order to exterminate Jews." "But I remember now, he died in a plane crash. How could they get his ghost?" "Who knows? Maybe he was hanging around the crash site. Or maybe they just think they have his ghost. Hold a seance, something answers and convinces them it's Reichenau, and there we are. But why collect him?" Fletcher put the bottle down and continued rifling the desk. Roger joined him. Fletcher pulled a paper out of the central drawer and hissed. He read for a few seconds at top speed, flipped back a page once to make sure of something, then thrust the paper up to Roger's face. It was titled, Verkörperungsverfahren. My German, Roger began apologetically. Embodiment process, Fletcher translated, snarling. He stuffed the paper into his pack and began pulling out grenades. That does it, he proclaimed. We're using the incendiary grenades. I was told to use my judgment, and this is how I judge. If it looked like we could gather intelligence and leave undetected, that's what we'd do. Then they wouldn't know that we knew their stuff. But if they have the surgical centaur, and especially the ghosts, they might have other dirty tricks we don't have time to find. So we're just going to blow the place up. Anyway, judging by the sounds of battle, a distraction might help. And really, I can't stand the thought of doing anything else. Right. Roger leapt back to the workbenches and grabbed a can of white powder. He poured it on the floor. This should help things along. Attaboy. Fletcher rummaged in his pockets and produced a lighter. Anyway, he growled, snatching up the Reichenauer bottle, they're not getting you. He loosened the cork, lit the lighter, and popped the bottle open, applying the lighter to the mouth at the same time. There was a fiery little puff. There. I'm only surprised Hal hadn't collected him already. Maybe Hal thought he'd be more use up here, said Roger. Good point. Fletcher handed Roger 4 incendiary grenades and pointed out where to throw them. They pulled pins and threw. Exant omnes, said Roger. He grabbed up his pack, clapped his invisibility cap on his head, vanished, and fell down the stairs. Fletcher grabbed his pack and leapt down the stairs after. These grenades had longish fuses, but still only 10 seconds. Then they would start to spray flaming white sulfur. As he plunged down the stairs, he watched Roger try to scramble up, grab his fallen Tarnkappa, then topple as he put weight on his right foot. Fletcher saw Roger trying to speed limp toward the door. As soon as he hit the bottom of the stairs, Fletcher seized Roger by the arm and dragged him outside, then kept on dragging. There was a nice big oak tree. Fletcher hoped it was at a good distance. He kept on dragging, ignoring Roger's yelps of pain. Pain or not, Roger tried to help. Fletcher heard, faint and far, a rising chorus of hissing and crackling. The things would burn for most of a minute. Paper, chemicals, wood, wood floor, wood furniture. Maybe soon something dramatic would... Something dramatic had caught. Maybe the powder Roger had thrown. Then there was the diesel fuel for the generator. That must be around somewhere. And all the kerosene that Ubersoldaten liked to drink. What's the problem? He demanded. Ankle. Broken or sprained or something. Right. Fletcher plunged a hand into Roger's coat and pulled out the magic crossbow quarrel. The Sagitta. Hey, that's mine, Roger protested. You mean you stole it first? Enemy are coming. To see what happened. To see who did it. We were supposed to be off and running seconds ago. Then give that to me and I'll run. I'll carry you. You would not. Fletcher started kicking off his boots. Eugene turned to an old centaur. Your black-haired uncle turned into a black-coated centaur. You'll turn into a lame centaur, and we'd be no further ahead. That's the way transformations work, isn't it, Mage? Roger looked miserable and nodded. Fletcher whipped his belt out of its loops. Anyway, with your 2 hours of practice, you'd be wobbling around like a new foal, even without the bum foot. Survive, heal, and change later. Roger nodded again and said, I'm sorry. Don't be. He kicked the pants away and pulled open his jacket. Do you think your family are the only people who long for deep strangeness? I'm the guy who volunteered to be the enchantress's guinea pig. I'm the guy who swallowed a ghost to see what it was like when I could do it for a good reason. He was down to shorts, undershirt, and socks. He decided that was enough. He paused to look back at the lodge. Ah, there we go. The windows glowed with flame and poured with smoke. That'll fetch them soon, Roger remarked, if the explosion didn't. Fletcher nodded, but still took time to lay out the backpacks, his gun belt, and his jacket on the ground, where he reckoned he could reach them quickly after the change. Then he picked up the arrow, the Sagitta. He stared at the point. Was he really going to do this? He heard yells sounding closer than before. He needed to be faster and stronger. Now. He pulled down the collar of his t-shirt and stabbed. The shock. Always the shock. If you could get used to it, you would be fey, not mortal. Was it worse this time? No telling, since his memory was one thing it screwed around with. Yet he must, in some sense, be used to it now, because he did not fall over, but put his forelegs down firmly and stood. He spread his arms and inhaled. One chest, then the other, filled. He was tall, massive, strong. Stuck. This was him, now and forever, or at least until further notice. Well, this was the him that was needed. He knelt with his forelegs and gathered up jacket, gun, and backpack. As he put them on, he looked around. For the last, how long? His focus had been deep in his body, not in his eyes and ears. While he was thus far inside, the fire had made its way to the ground floor. The yelling voices had become closer and more numerous, and Roger had propped himself up against the oak, gun drawn, scanning for visible enemies. He turned his gaze on the new Fletcher. "How is it?" he asked. "Good. Fine. I'm solid. I'm ready. What have I missed?" Roger gestured back to the lodge with his gun hand. "They've arrived, but no one's noticed us yet." "What luck." The porch windows glowed and the door poured smoke. Before it were several figures. Some stood, others cringed and hopped and gesticulated. There was a lot of yelling and at least one protracted wail. "One guy in a lad coat dashed in," Roger said. "An Uber-soldat ran in after him and chucked him out again. That's him hopping around wailing. The Uber hasn't come out." And no one noticed miracles happening a few yards away, quite distracted, as was I. Roger alarmed Fletcher with a short giggle. "They are distracted, but you are confused. Confused with horse." Fletcher replied with a short snort, noticing with a corner of his mind that this now felt both more forceful and more natural than before. "So I am. Let's make use of it. That's why I did it." He crouched down. "Climb on, grab my backpack." Roger hopped over and obeyed. He yipped a couple of times as his bad foot gave him pain, but at least this apparently stemmed the hysteria that seemed to be brewing. "Does it feel the same as the seaming?" he asked as Fletcher rose. "Look around," Fletcher said curtly, looking himself. "All clear?" he asked, waited not at all for an answer, and headed away from the fire at a brisk trot. "To answer your question," he said a few seconds later, once the yelling lost volume, "yes, it's a lot like the seaming. It feels familiar. And I can remember how to use my legs, which is a damn good thing." "Walk, trot, canter, gallop, and all?" asked Roger. There was a wistful note in his voice. "Yes, this forest doesn't look like good galloping terrain, though." But he did kick it up to a canter. "How did you learn?" Roger asked. "I'll be happy to answer questions when we're safely back behind our lines. Right now, I think our lines are this way. Do you?" Yes. Good. Keep your gun out and keep a lookout." In fact, Fletcher had figured out horse gaits while practicing with the seaming skin in the woods behind Miss Blackholt's cottage. As he had told Ivy just a few hours ago, he had grown up on a farm, a horse farm, and was quite at home in a saddle, or had been until a few minutes ago. So he knew what the gaits looked like and how they felt to a rider. He had worked it out from there. He contemplated putting on his tarnkappa, but thought once about running invisibly on unfamiliar legs and immediately dropped the idea. But there was Roger. "Do you want to put your tarnkappa on?" he asked, turning his head over his shoulder a fraction. "I daren't, but there's no reason for anyone to know I have a rider." "I won't be able to aim very well," Roger answered. Fletcher nodded and sped up his canter. Bracken crashed under his hooves. It was quite impossible to canter quietly through a forest. Twigs and dry leaves saw to that. Roger noticed the sound, too. I could cast a hush against the noise, but it'll keep wearing off, he said apologetically. Fletcher nodded, adding, and one can't aim and cast at the same time. We'll just run. It soon became clear that they were indeed heading for the battle line. The sounds of yelling and gunfire increased. The Grand Normans had landed in a clearing and then started for the lodge, but had been met by Übersoldaten. While their countrymen engaged those, Roger and Fletcher had skirted a long and invisible route around the battle to tackle the laboratory. Fletcher wondered if any more Ahnenerbers would be distracted into turning back to rescue their lab. Soon he would have to start a new detour or simply plow through the thick of the fighting. Before that could happen, something leapt on his right hip and grappled with Roger, who screamed. Fletcher bucked. He had not planned it, but he had no regrets. He skidded to a stop and turned as quickly as he could. There was his assailant already getting up. Fletcher strode over and punched him in the side of the head, only instead of punching with his right fist, he had reared end punched with his right forehoof. Unplanned, but unregretted. Where was Roger? There he was, picking himself up, half limping, half hopping toward Fletcher. Shaking with adrenaline, Fletcher grabbed him under one arm, lifted, turned, and swung him onto his back. Got your gun? He asked the young mage. Oddly, yes. Bugger, what's that? The sound of battle was rising. The front was coming to them. Tarnkappen? Roger suggested diffidently. The risks of invisibility remained, but new risks were headed their way. Yes, I think so. Fletcher reached over his shoulder and groped in the backpack. He hauled out the utterly black hat. Very briefly, Roger was riding air instead of centaur. Then Roger clapped his own hat on and vanished. An invisible target can still get in the way of a bullet. Fletcher decided it was time to take another risk, the gallop. There had been room for no more than short bursts on the forest paths back in Oswick. With a word of warning to Roger, he lit out. A few bounds in, all went quiet. In for a penny, in for a pound, came Roger's muffled voice. Fletcher replied with an equally muffled laugh. Galloping was different. And we'll find out how different it is next time.